In this video, I'm going to show you the game of, in my opinion, the most impressive player of the FIDE Candidates tournament so far. It is Gukesh. And the reason why I think his play is just simply outstanding, it's also because of his age. He's only 17 years old, but playing very mature chess, not making any big blunders, coming up with creative new ideas in the opening, and just playing very solid chess. So that's a very good sign to try to become the winner of this FIDE Candidates tournament. And I will show you the game he is playing in round 12 against Nijat Abasov. And Abasov, we know his story, and now his qualification for this event was quite remarkable with a fantastic run at the World Cup. But he is the bottom seed. He is struggling in this event. He is not making that many points at all. But he's playing with white, and for Gukesh, it is very important to play for a win because he's half a point behind tournament leader Jan Nepomniachtchi, and with only 4 more rounds to go, it is very important trying to score more points. Well, I'm going to show you this game. I also have some other very exciting news, as now you can also support the channel by making a donation via PayPal. You can find the PayPal link in the description under this video. So if you feel like you like my videos, well, don't hesitate and go to PayPal, and well, up to you how much you would like to donate. And of course, I also appreciate any other form of support, for instance, by becoming a subscriber to the channel, or give it a like, share it among your friends. Any of your help is more than welcome. So having enough said, we are going to see what Abasov did on move 1. It's 1d4. Knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. The Nimzo Indian, and we have the so-called classical variation. Not a big surprise, this has been played before by Abasov, in black. Has a lot of possibilities here, and most of these lines, they are pretty forcing, and it's difficult to come up with new ideas. But not if your name is Gukesh or you have fantastic seconds here. Because here on this move 4, we have a very unusual move with the move h6. At least it's not a move I have seen before. I looked in the database, has been played a number of times, and even by transposition we do get to see some Grandmaster games later on. But very interesting idea, and it also has a point because you're preventing the bishop from coming to g5 to pin that knight on f6. Now, white has also various ways of playing. I think a move like e4 could be one of the critical ideas. I'm very curious to see what Gukesh had in mind if this move was played. But Abasov plays in a more solid way with developing the knight to f3. Black goes for the move c5, putting pressure against the pawn on d4. White captures on c5, and here the typical Nimzo maneuver, knight a6. So the knight is ready to take back the pawn on c5. White goes g3, intending to fianchetto the bishop. So knight takes c5, bishop to g2, and here the knight comes to e4, pinning that knight on c3, which of course can't take on e4. Castling kingside, knight takes c3, b takes c3. So now you have double these pawns. Black drops back with the bishop to c5, so that's a nice post for the bishop. Cannot easily be chased away. But white is grabbing now the initiative in the center. And I think this is a very interesting moment, as you would probably expect at some point black to play something like b6, bishop b7. But if you do it now, b6, there's e5 attacking the knight. If the knight goes to h7, what is this knight doing there? Then white all of a sudden has this move knight g5 with a discovered attack on the rook, as well as a threat against the knight, as the queen is also hitting the knight on h7. So white is winning material in that case. This was seen in the game of Naranjan against Marsoglu in the World Blitz Championships last year in Uzbekistan. But Gukesh must have seen that game. He comes up with a very small but important refinement upon that game. Instead of b6, he first plays the move knight h7. What an insane looking idea. But he just anticipates this move e5, which was played in the game anyway. But now it's rook b8. So the rook is getting out of that file and prepares for the move b6. Knight comes to d2. So the knight is on its way to e4 to attack the bishop on c5. b6 played. knight e4, and anyway the bishop comes to b7. And well, I think that's also a very interesting moment, because there is this option to take on c5. And if you take back, well, you can take on b7, rook takes b7. This knight on h7 seems to be out of play, but there are possibilities to get back into play, maybe via g5, looking for one of these weak squares, or via f8 to g6. And I also think this bishop on c1, it's not able to exert a lot of pressure, because pawns on c3 and e5, they are fixed on the same color in a relatively close position, with imbalance in pawn structure and knight versus bishop. I think that's exactly what Gukesh is looking for in this game. Well, anyway, white didn't capture on c5, played instead here the move h4, covering the g5 square. So the knight on h7 is stranded, but black has interesting options here as well. Queen c7, eyeing the pawn on e5, but you're not really threatening to take it, because white played here this move rook d1, and queen takes e5 would be met here by bishop to f4, and the rook on b8 is hanging when the queen moves. So rather than taking on e5, here Gukesh comes up with a great idea. He shows some understanding in this position by taking on e4. And how is white going to respond to this move? If you do take with the bishop to attack the knight on h7, then the response is going to be f5. Great shot, capturing en passant, renewing the threat against the knight, will be met by queen takes g3, and the pawn on f2 is pinned. So here white's position is falling apart. You may consider going back with the bishop, but then black is even able to seize the initiative with a move like g5, trying to open up the king side. Who knows, the h-file may be opened soon. I think black is in really good shape here. So instead of taking with the bishop, queen takes e4 was played, but now the knight is safe. It's time to castle here. The bishop comes out to f4. And well, white has the bishop pair, but it's a relatively close position, and there are these long-term weaknesses on the c-file. But big problem for black is that the knight on h7 is pretty much offside. But you can do something about it by playing first rook fd8, defending the pawn. And after rook d2, you see that white is also intending to double. Well, knight comes to f8, so it defends the pawn. And knight g6 could be an idea to attack the bishop on f4. Also the pawn on e5 is a target, so therefore white goes h5 to take away that square from the black knight. So still that knight is not looking great, and what should black do? It's not going to be easy to put pressure against that pawn on c4 or the pawn on c3. If you move the bishop away and for instance put a rook on the c-file, white can always play something like bishop f1. So attacking the pawns on the c-file is not the right way of playing, but I think that what Gukesh does is very instructive. He played here a move a lot of people would not have considered, I think. b5. With this move, you're basically solving these isolated double pawns on the c-file. White captured, rook takes. Why did black go for this line? Well, after bishop f1, the rook is under threat. The rook goes back to b6. Rook ad1 is played. And now it's rook db8. So here we see that thanks to the knight defending the pawn on d7, the black rooks are simply more active and ready to enter somewhere, depending on how white is gonna place its pieces. Still, I think it's not gonna be anything too special. If white is gonna make a useful move, like king g2 for instance, or maybe get the bishop to c4 to keep everything defended, the position is more or less even. But white played here the move a4 instead, and I have my doubts about this move, because the rook comes into b3 to hit the pawn on c3, and white got to defend it, maybe with rook c2. In the game, Abasov decided to put a rook on d3, but now the rook comes to a3, and there's pressure against both these pawns. So now all of a sudden white got to think about all these weaknesses. Well, in the game, there followed rook f3. Is white looking for some attacking play? To be honest, I'm not sure. I don't see the attack coming very soon. But what I do like is the move here by Gukesh, as he played queen c6, offering the exchange of queens, neutralizing white's potential initiative on the king side, and also targeting the pawn on a4. So after queen takes c6, Pawn takes c6. Rook goes back to d3. Black is just collecting a pawn. And of course, white still has the bishop pair and the knight on f8 is pretty passive. Also the pawn on a7 is not queening anytime soon. But a pawn is a pawn and you got something to play for. Bishop g2, attacking the pawn on c6. And here there are various interesting possibilities. Black played here the move rook a2. He decided not to defend the pawn on c6, but rather attack the pawn on f2. Now you got to do something about it, probably rook d2. Rook 3 d2 is a very precise move, but rook 1 d2 was played, and here rooks were exchanged on d2. But it should be said that possibly it's better to keep rooks on the board. Why? Well, if you play rook d1, then you can get in with your other rook to b1 and putting pressure against this rook. Now the rooks are going to be exchanged under favorable circumstances. If the bishop blocks on f1, your pawn on c6 is no longer hanging. If you go king h2, well, then the pawn on f2 is hanging. So here, after rook a1, I definitely think there are some issues. Probably white is supposed to go king h2 here. But then the a pawn is really fast, and with two pairs of rooks on the board, you don't mind giving up your pawn on c6 because there's a4. And look at this rook on a1. Together with the rook on b8, I think black has fantastic prospects of pushing that a pawn even further. I don't see what white is going to do next. Anyway, in the game, Gukesh went for the move rook takes d2. Rooks are being swapped here. And well, the difference is that now if you give a check on b1, king h2, the rook is still covering the pawn on f2. So instead, now Gukesh played rook c8, sticking to the extra pawn. But the bishop comes to e4. Black is advancing the pawn to a5. But the bishop is stopping the pawn in time. If you play rook a8, the bishop comes to a4. Nice blockading piece, attacking the pawn on c6 as well. But instead of rook a8, look at what Gukesh did now. g5, attacking the bishop on f4. H takes g6, knight takes g6. So there is this idea at some point maybe to trade off the knight for the bishop, to double the pawns, and to create another outside passed pawn. How should white deal with it? Well, not easy at all. But apparently something like bishop takes g6 is pretty interesting. Better don't take that pawn on h6 because the pawn comes to a4 and a3 where it's getting supported by the bishop. The other rook will come in very soon. Looks like black is close to be winning there. But if you play rook a2 with the idea to attack the pawn, and if black defends it with rook a8, then you can take on h6. And well, probably there are still good drawing chances. But was not played in the game. White, very understandable, doesn't want to trade off that bishop for the knight. Instead played here king to g2. Black played king g7 to defend the pawn. Bishop comes to a4. And well, you always have the option to take on f4. But with opposite colored bishops, things are not so simple. How is black going to queen any of these rook's pawns? That's far from clear. So what Gukesh did is, in my opinion, a much more pragmatic way of trying to put your opponent under pressure. Knight e7 is improving the knight, defending the pawn. So possibly the rook can be activated very soon, or the knight can come into to d5. If you play something, for instance, rook to b2, knight d5 is a nice idea to attack the pawn on c3. But okay, after bishop d2, still not easy to convert your advantage. In any case, rook b2 was not played. White played c4 to deprive the knight from gaining access to the d5 square. But it's a serious weakening move of the dark squares, because now this bishop is getting more possibilities. Rook b8 played, trying to come in to b4 and hit the bishop as well as the pawn on c4. So therefore rook a2. Bishop to b4 played to secure the pawn. King f3. Rook to d8. Rook is now finding a new file, trying to infiltrate somewhere. Bishop went to e3. So the idea is probably to put your king somewhere on e2 or maybe e4. Idea is maybe to come g4 and f4, restricting the knight on e7. That is the plan. But rook d3 is a fantastic idea, as you're pinning the bishop on e3. And after king e2, king e4 is another option, but it will also, both moves will be met by the move rook to c3. And the pawn on c4 is in trouble. This is the key idea. Also, if you do play something like rook c2, well, there is rook to a3, and the bishop is just gonna be trapped at the side of the board. So here instead c5 is played. This is setting a little trap, because black should not take on c5. It will be met by bishop d2, attacking the rook, and once the rook moves away, pawn on a5 can be taken. So rather than taking the pawn, Abasov just surrenders the d5 square. Gukesh comes in with that knight to d5, and that's a great idea. And note that the pawn on c6 is now no longer defended by the knight. But if you do take on c6, black is making use of a nice tactical shot here. With rook takes e3, you're eliminating the bishop, and you're vacating the c3 square for the knight fork, and that means that black will be a piece up. Fantastic move. You cannot take the pawn on c6. Black is extending its positional advantages by making use of all these tactical possibilities. Not surprisingly, a knight is going to be involved with this tactic. So anyway, after knight e5, rook c2 is played. Rook takes c2, bishop takes c2. Now at least the pawn on c6 is no longer hanging, but look at this, pawn goes to a4. Great idea. Bishop takes is met once again by this knight fork on c3, winning the bishop. So you can't take the pawn, but then after king to d3, the pawn can be placed on a3. It is supported by the bishop on b4, and that means that at least one of white's pieces, the bishop now in this case, got to stop the pawn. Maybe later the king can take over, but black is in the driver's seat and it's difficult for white to become active. King comes to g6. Now all black's pieces are greatly placed, and the king is about to join. Bishop to d4, keeping everything defended. But the king comes to g5. King to c4 played. Bishop to e1. Now, this bishop still got to defend both the pawn on f2 as well as it wants to maintain control over the a1 square. King to d3. King to g4. Here you see that black is about to play this move king to f3 when the pawn on f2 can be captured. Therefore, the bishop goes back to d1. But after king g5, the bishop comes to b3, and look at this, the king goes to f5. This is an amazing way of putting your opponent into zugzwang, because what should this bishop do? The bishop gotta move. If you move it to c4 or a2, for instance, let's say bishop c4, now the king is able to come in to f3. And if you ever play something like king e2, there's this idea to put your bishop on c3, offering the exchange of bishops, and well, that should technically just be winning for black. In any case, black didn't have to go for this move king g4, because they followed the move king to c4. Not really sure what the idea is, but there's not a good other move, because this bishop also got to keep the pawn defended. The bishop from b3 cannot move, so therefore king move is forced, king c4, but now the king enters via e4, intending once again king f3, bishop d1 to keep the king out, but then it's a2. The bishop still controlling the a1 square, f3 is played, forcing the king to come back. It's not a problem, because we are creating new targets. Bishop to c2 check, king goes to g5, and here bishop comes to b3 to attack the pawn, trying to wrap it up. But there's bishop takes g3, and after bishop takes a2, at least you have eliminated one outside passed pawn. But here the next one is coming, h5, and look at this. Pawn is coming to h4, to h3, to h2, h1. There's nothing you can do against it. This bishop is far away, the king is far away, and bishop can come to g1, but it doesn't stop the h-pawn from being pushed, because bishop on g3 supports the pawn to reach h2. So here, Black is about to win a piece by force. Abasov resigned. What an impressive, simple game by Gukesh, starting with that amazing opening idea, very unknown concept with his move h6 on move 4, and then from a more or less equalish type of position, he managed to completely outplay his opponent with the use of these imbalances in the structure. That is what top players do in order to beat lower rated players. Create imbalances and they have something to work with in the long run. Very impressive game, and that means that Gukesh is back in the shared lead together with Jan Nepomniachtchi, who managed to win his game. Managed to draw his game, but also Hikaru Nakamura managed to win his game. So all these three players, Nepomniachtchi, Gukesh, and Hikaru, they're all on 7.5 out of 12 plus 3. Very impressive. 2 more games to play. And who is going to win this event? We will find out this weekend. It's going to be very exciting. I will cover all the interesting moments on this channel. So you know what to do. Just hit the subscribe button or make a small donation. All the support is appreciated, guys. Thanks for doing that. And we see each other very soon again. Bye bye.